All right, guys, good morning. So today we're going to go over intelligence and kind of highlight some things that are going to be critical that I want you to remember for your quiz. So let's start with Alfred Binet. So he is one of the first people to use IQ tests in the way that we think about them now. His original use for those IQ tests was to basically separate children so that they could have the most beneficial education in the French school system. So that's how it was started, how intelligence tests were started and how they were used in their relationship to school. One of Benet's big concerns was that eventually it might be used in the wrong way or to communicate the wrong type of message. Eventually, the tests were quite useful and they were quite good at being able to parcel out who would be successful in which classroom. And they began to be used not only in France, but they were also brought to the United States. One of the bigger issues that started to arise is that sometimes the tests would measure things that they were not necessarily interested in. So they would measure cultural awareness and understanding, and that would produce a certain score. This would become a problem. Even as the test started to be adapted for the United States and different countries, their cultural bias remained. So if you're like, what is cultural bias? What does that mean? It basically means that folks are being asked questions that don't necessarily try to understand their intelligence or how they're able to solve problems, but instead get at their cultural understanding or knowledge. So for example, when I was teaching in Mississippi, when I was in rural Mississippi, I was teaching GED courses, and I was preparing each student for the compare and contrast portion of the test. I spent a lot of time with these students, and I was actually able to sit down with each individual student. So I assumed that in that context, they would do really well on their test because I had actually sat down and taught each one individually. So on the test, the first question was to compare and contrast Romeo and Juliet compared to the West Side Story. And one of my students asked, what was the West Side Story? So my mistake in creating the test was assuming that everyone had read or had watched the West Side Story, which is a cultural value, right? You shouldn't have to know what those two stories are in order to answer the question. The question is about comparing and contrasting. Had I given them something that was culturally relevant to those individuals, they probably would have understood the skill that they were trying to display. Okay, so that's an example of when there can be cultural bias in the way that tests are given, are created. So that's one of the drawbacks of IQ testing and one of the issues. And there is a lot more. And I want you to watch the video that I've attached about some of the other problems with intelligence testing. So what are some other things that happen in intelligence testing that allow us to compare and contrast different scores? The first one is reliability. So what that means is that it consistently measures the same thing over and over again. Generally speaking, IQ tests are pretty reliable, meaning that regardless of when you take them, regardless of how old you are, usually about after 6 or 7, they are good predictors of how well you'll perform later in life. They're not perfect, and this is not to say that everyone is, a perfect example of this, but generally speaking, on average, they're pretty good predictors. So validity, another thing that IQ tests are always trying to kind of grasp at or understand is validity. So are they measuring what they're interested in measuring? Are they actually able to measure how well someone will perform in school, and also how well they might do in other domains that might require intelligence? So what about IQ tests for very young children? How reliable are they? They are not that reliable. So what that means is that before 6 years old, which I kind of alluded to earlier, an IQ test is not a great predictor of how someone will do in long term or for the rest of their lives. They're usually only good to identify children who are very, very behind, not folks who might need a little bit of help. So what are some other things that could affect your IQ? We've talked about this a lot, and actually if you go through the slide, you will see Bukowski. He's back again. Bukowski and Piaget are all throughout this semester, and they'll come back many, many times. So speaking of that, some of the things that can affect your IQ score or your environment. So we know that environments that are very, very rich and stimulating for the child are often associated with higher levels of IQ. So let's compare and contrast something called an achievement and an aptitude test. Now, sometimes there are some tests which kind of blur the lines, but we're going to try to keep it as neat, clean and neat as possible for example purposes. Achievement tests are when you have a specific amount of knowledge in a specific area. So for example, if you are taking an achievement test, okay, we're talking about your math test, your reading test, what have you. You learn about a subject, and then you take a subject in a particular area. An aptitude test is supposed to be able to predict how well you will perform later on in a specific field or in school in general. So an aptitude test might be the ACT. The ACT is correlated with your GPA in college. So on average, so this is on average, right? And we always want to keep in mind when I say on average, it doesn't mean psychology is good at predicting an aggregate. It's never really great at predicting an individual person because as people, we're quite messy. So again, on average, an aptitude test is able to predict how well you'll perform in college or in a specific circumstance or setting. So let's talk about ways that you can improve your memory and your cognitive functioning. And I'm going to go over those different things that could help. Some of them you've already heard of and you're probably quite familiar with, which is mental exercise. So that's going to be memory training, kind of helping with your processing. Those things seem to be helpful in general. But some things that can really help are going to be like exercise, like just regular exercise. So walking, running, jogging, whatever you want to do for exercise, those things are going to help to maintain your mental functioning over time. So what are some things that might make it more difficult over time and might kind of mask your, your ability to function really well? And one of those things are going to be multitasking. So we know that folks who are heavy multitaskers or who do it very frequently, they tend on average to get a lot more distracted than folks who don't multitask. And what's interesting and counterintuitive is that they generally have a more difficult time switching between or moving between two different tasks. So if they are asked to do something and they have to transition, normally for most of us, we have like a transition lag, or when we move between tasks, there are a few of us who don't have this, but on average, folks tend to take a little bit longer if they're moving between tasks to basically concentrate again. So they're less likely, they take longer to do that, and they're also less likely to use the information that they already have to solve a new problem. So basically each problem is its own, conundrum, so to speak. So now that we've talked about ways that you can basically improve your intellectual functioning and kind of get more bang for your buck, let's talk about folks who are on the ends of the bell curve. So you're going to basically review a video about intellectual testing and IQ testing, and you're going to see that most of us, it falls on a curve. Like most human traits, they all fall on a curve. And what you're going to see at the ends of the curve, which are less likely, we have intellectual disabilities and the intellectually gifted. So intellectually, both of these folks are at the tail end of this graph that you're going to look at. The idea now is that folks with intellectual disabilities and the intellectually gifted should be integrated as much as possible into regular ed classes, or what is called mainstreaming. You want to be able to provide them with the least restrictive environment, specifically when we talk about folks with intellectual disabilities. So most individuals who have intellectual disabilities are not severely disabled, meaning that most of them are able to do everything that everyone else is able to do. And most of it is it runs in your family. That's the same way with giftedness. Usually it is something that is found in one's family. So, and when we talk about the intellectually gifted, like I mentioned, it also runs in families. And these folks on average tend to be healthier. They tend to be better adjusted over the course of their lives. Now, again, on average, they generally tend to earn more money. Sometimes they were considered disruptive or inappropriate in school. This is often because they may find themselves to be really bored in a classroom setting. And there are two options. There's acceleration. So that means that they are allowed to skip grades, kind of like that TV show Smart Guy, or there's enrichment. This is when they are taken out of school for 1 day a week and they are provided with additional classes to provide enrichment.